Alright guys, how's it going? First of all, let me start by wishing you all a very happy new year. Second, let me note that I have read all of your emails and comments over the past week and a half, even though I haven't responded to all of them like I normally do. I have had a hell of a time getting myself set up here in Scotland and a really irritating PC issue. But on those emails and messages you've been sending me, especially today and yesterday, many of you have emailed me to ask if I've been following this. Intel's massive CPU bug, which leaves the kernel vulnerable and will slow down performance after it is patched. We're going to hear a lot about this over the coming weeks. And don't worry, I've been following it of course, for days in fact, and I'll take a proper look at it once we have some more solid information. But for this video, it's something different, something I've been planning for quite some time, and it's even more bad news for Intel. So let's take a look back. Not far, it's not even 3 months in fact, and the launch of Intel's new Coffee Lake architecture. Now, I launched a few videos back then, and the most popular and interesting by far one was the Great Coffee Lake Con job. And the con in that video came as a double whammy. The first part was about how Intel and the motherboard guys conned some reviewers with multi-core enhancement, or MCE, which basically gave a free overclock to the i7-8700K, all the way from 4.3 to 4.7 GHz, and this resulted in wildly different benchmark results from site to site, as we can see here. A 25% difference in results like Cinebench R15 multi-threading, and these four at the end here, the 1500 plus scores, these were the result of basically a free overclock. That was Linus, Gamers Nexus, Jay's 2 Cents and Hardware Canucks. Now, these guys weren't very happy, apart from Linus, who obviously doesn't care, but the rest of the guys weren't very happy about me supposedly calling them out on this. The fact is, I was simply reporting what I saw and what I had read and watched in their reviews. SkyMTL at Hardware Canucks in particular seemed very upset while denying any wrongdoing, but that didn't stop him from going back and changing his article later on. So we can pretty much consider that point proven. These guys here benched with multi-core enhancement enabled, the i7-8700K at 4.7 GHz. That is a fact. And if this is what calling out is, then there'll be a lot more calling out in 2018, I'm pretty sure. So all of these scores here were basically not legitimate. And in this video I said the scores around the 1400 marks, these look like the proper scores. And there's one or two just a little bit lower, and some even quite a bit lower. But these early ones that we saw, the HP Omen and the X Preview results, these were pre-release results. And looking at all of this together, I speculated that the likely reason for this came down to silicon quality and other stuff like cooling performance. How good is the cooler being used in the review? And Hilbert over at Guru3D, he took issue at that speculation, labelling me as a conspiracy theorist and gaining popularity and views by just doing that. So of course I signed up and had a bit of an interesting chat with Hilbert. It all ended fairly amicably, we agreed to disagree, and that was pretty much the end of that. But we still had the problem of these lower scores. Also in the Great Coffee Lake Con job video, I showed how Turbo Boost Technology 2.0 works, how it depends on the type of workload and a bunch of stuff like temperatures, the number of active cores. All of that affects the maximum turbo. And up until Coffee Lake had launched, Intel had always provided numbers for this. They always specified the base clock, the maximum turbo clock, and everything in between. But with Coffee Lake, Intel were no longer providing this information. They were now only including processor frequencies for base and single core turbos in their materials going forward. So nothing in between, you simply got the base clock and the single core turbo. So a CPU like, for example, the i7-8700, Intel now only declared a base clock of 3.2 GHz and a single core turbo of 4.6 GHz. All the rest of these numbers were ascertained by probing the P states, but Intel was no longer giving this information willfully. And my conclusion was that Intel was basically up to no good here. And simply put, if all they guaranteed was a base clock of 3.2 GHz and a single core turbo of 4.6 GHz, then that is all that they have to provide, and everything else is a bonus. In this video in particular, I railed against the i5-8400. The simple fact of the matter is, it was a very popular CPU, and it looked like a lot of people were kind of losing their minds over it. But I did not like this 2.8 GHz base clock, a full 1 GHz less than the supposed 3.8 GHz all-core turbo. That's the one I railed against, but with hindsight, the smart one would have been to pick on the i7-8700. Just over a couple of months later, and over at Computer Base, the Medion Eraser X67015 in the test, the all-day gaming PC with the Core i7-8700 and GeForce GTX 1070. Now, Aldi, as you almost certainly know, are a very large supermarket chain. and they also sell pre-built PCs. And recently they had begun selling AMD CPUs with the Ryzen 5s, and that was in the news just about a month before this. Now we can see the case here, it's a typical OEM type design. There's an awful lot of stuff crammed in there, and it's very much what the typical PC looks like in fact. Also interestingly, a Z370 motherboard from ECS. And as is typical with most OEM builds, it uses fairly cheap and slow memory, at least from the enthusiast perspective. These PCs will be selling by the tens of thousands plus. So even though the proper memory for Coffee Lake would be DDR4 2666 MHz, it's just not cheap enough to be viable in an OEM build like this. Now it's got a rather bog standard looking GTX 1070 as well, but the real part of interest is of course the i7-8700. It's not the K, but as we saw in the P states, the Core i7-8700 should perform just a little bit below an 8700K. And ComputerBase had already tested the i7-8700 separately. In that case it was using the DDR4 2666 memory, so there was some expectation here that this PC, this Aldi PC, would maybe fall just a little bit short based on the slightly slower memory speed. However, when benching Cinebench, Handbrake and TrueCrypt, the 8700 fell short of the Ryzen 5 1600X. And as we can see here in Cinebench's testing, their review i7-8700 scored 1389 points, whereas the i7-8700 in the Aldi PC only scores 1203. That is 15% short in Cinebench R15. In Handbrake it's even worse, 19% behind the release day CPU, and its best result in TrueCrypt has it 8% behind. So what is the explanation for this rather poor performance? Well, according to ComputerBase, looking at the clock rates under load using hardware info provides the explanation, as apparently the processor can run for about 15 seconds under load on all cores, up to 80 watts of power, and then the consumption is capped at 65 watts, which is of course the TDP of the i7-8700. And again they point out that this was not the case for the motherboards used by ComputerBase, or anybody else for that matter, for the separate CPU test in October. As a result, the clock of the processor in the Medion Eraser drops from 4.3 GHz, the supposed all-core turbo of the i7-8700, down to only 3.6 to 3.7 GHz after about 15 seconds. And they also note that while running Prime 95, the clocks drop to 3.1 GHz instead of 4.3. Now obviously ComputerBase needed more information on what exactly was happening here, so they contacted Medion, who said, this is according to Intel spec, the CPU has a TDP of 65 watts, and that is the performance provided by the motherboard. Even though it's a Z370, the motherboard only provides 65 watts of power. This is simply based on the quality of the components, like I suggested back in my video, although my suggestion was that this is what we would see with the B and H motherboards. In this case, we're even seeing it with a Z370 motherboard. Cooling is of course also a major factor in this. But interestingly, Medion also said that there are indeed some gaming motherboards with a Z370 chipset that can provide higher TDP performance. We know this because we saw it in all the reviews. Every Z370 we saw reviewed is capable of possibly 125 watts plus. But the interesting part was the CPU, that is the 8700, will then achieve higher clock rates, but will operate outside of its specification. Now this is an important point because you think of an OEM like HP or Dell selling hundreds of thousands to millions of these pre-built machines. Every one of them will be built to specification because they're not going to lose money on returns. If they have a bunch of problem CPUs, Intel would simply say to them, you're running the CPU out of spec. It's your problem, not ours. So they are never gonna do that. They will run the CPU at spec. But ComputerBase also contacted Intel to ask about this, and they said that the i7-8700 should score 1383 points, which is around about what ComputerBase scored using the Gigabyte Z370 gaming. And they continue that the CPU is expected to start with the maximum turbo clock of 4.3 GHz on all cores for up to only around 8 seconds, and then the clock is reduced in order to not overtax 65 watts of cooling. And they then say that the clock should at this time, however, fall only slightly to 4.1 to 4.2 GHz. But in contrast to this, Medion seems to have set the motherboard and processor up that it will run at 80 watts of TDP for about 15 seconds instead of 8, and then the clock will fall to 3.6 or 3.7 GHz. And Intel did not say that this was the wrong way to do it, as the exact power values may depend on the OEM's configuration. This is a kind of wishy-washy answer, the kind that you would expect from Intel PR when dealing with an issue like this. But Computer Base end by saying it can be assumed that other OEMs, with this and with other CPUs, will have a comparable procedure. But I wasn't really satisfied with any of these answers, so I decided to take a closer look at it and the Coffee Lake datasheet. But before that, we'll take a quick look at the i7-8700 over at Intel's ARC website. So just launched, as we know, around about $300 mark, 6 cores, 12 threads. And as noted, a processor base frequency of 3.2 GHz. What happens if you click on this little question mark though? Right, the processor base frequency describes the rate at which the processor's transistors open and close. The processor base frequency is the operating point where TDP is defined. Right, so basically what they're saying is 3.2 GHz is where the 65 watts of TDP is defined for this processor. We know it's a 65 watt TDP processor, and here's the TDP. Let's click on this. TDP, the thermal design power TDP, represents the average power in watts the processor dissipates when operating at the base frequency, with all cores active under an Intel-defined high complexity workload. So that all seems rather straightforward. Yes, the i7-8700 processor is a 65 watt TDP processor at around 3.2 GHz. But remember, this should be the minimum, as this would be the worst quality silicon basically being validated as being good enough for the 8700 SKU. But back to the 8th generation Intel processor datasheet, and we'll just start by typing in TDP, and we have 87 results. So let's go through these and see what's said in the datasheet. Now we need to go through quite a few of them, down to 14 in fact, before we find something interesting. Talking about Intel Turbo Boost Technology 2.0, where the interesting part is it allows to increase power above TDP as high as PL2 for short periods of time. Now we'll get to this PL2 part in a minute, as slightly further down at thermal considerations, we see that the processor TDP is the maximum sustained power that should be used for the design of the processor thermal solution. And once again we see what we saw on the ARC website, that it is validated during manufacturing for the best configuration when executing a near worst case commercially available workload as specified by Intel. In other words, 3.2 GHz, 65 watts. And again we see that the TDP may be exceeded for short periods of time or if running a very high power workload. And finally, the duration and time of such operation can be limited by platform runtime configurable registers within the processor. So this is how the OEM sets TDP limits. And here we find out all about PL1 and PL2. Under Package Power Control, the Package Power Control settings of PL1, PL2, PL3, PL4 and Tau allow the designer to configure Intel Turbo Boost to match the platform power delivery and package thermal solution limitations. And for PL1, Intel recommends that this is set equal to TDP power, but also that it should not be set higher than the thermal solution cooling limits. So let's say, for example, you only had 45 watts dissipation, then PL1 should be set equal to 45 watts. Otherwise, it should be set equal to the TDP of the CPU. In the case of the i7-8700 and CPUs like the i5-8400, that would of course be 65 watts. And we don't really learn much about power limit 2 here. It just says a threshold that, if exceeded, the PL2 rapid power limiting algorithms will attempt to limit the spike above PL2. That doesn't really tell us a great deal as yet. But if we now search for PL2 in the document, we get to this rather interesting diagram, where the first note is, implementing Turbo Boost only requires a configuration of PL1, PL1 Tau and PL2. So forget about PL4 and all that. This is really high power. We can see here in the chart, we're talking power spikes here, which should only be allowed to peak for up to around 10 milliseconds, so very short period of time. The interesting part is this PL1 and PL2. PL1 and the blue dotted line, power could sustain here forever. In other words, the 8700 could hold this line at 65 watts. This next part is the interesting part though, between PL1 and PL2, where the power here could be sustained for up to 100 seconds. But how big a number are we talking about here? Well, we know that PL1 is 65 watts, so PL2 is probably 80 watts? Remember the number that Computer Base saw when they ran hardware info? And the CPU was holding 80 watts for 15 seconds, not around 100 seconds, only 15 seconds before it had to drop back to PL1. But can we be confident of that? We can, because if you look at Intel's 7th generation processor datasheet, here we see power limit 1, power limit 1 tau, and power limit 2. They're talking about the 91 watt quad cores. That is your i5-7600K, which has a TDP of 91 watts. Now remember, that would only be 3.8 GHz for the i5-7600K. Once again, processor base frequency. That is the operating point where TDP is defined. So 91 watts at 3.8 GHz. For the i5-7600K, and we can see that 1.25 times the TDP is the power limit that it can turbo to under PL2. Again, that'll be for around about 100 seconds. The interesting part, of course, 1.25 times the TDP in the case of 65 watt TDP CPUs would be around 80 watts. So we know that PL2 is basically 25% extra. That is how much more power available to the CPU. But you may be wondering, well, why is it not doing it for 100 seconds? And that simply comes down to the quality of the components. I mean, if you want to stick a Noctua NHD15 on that, then sure, it will probably sustain it for around 100 seconds. If you're going to put something less of a cooling solution on there, it is simply not safe. The heat will just continue to rise, with the corresponding risk of damaging the components. In the end, these 65 watt CPUs were designed to operate at 65 watts, but the CPUs can maintain that extra clock speed depending on the motherboard, depending on the cooling. And if you remember over at Computer Base, Intel said this should be for 8 seconds. This is what this tau thing is all about, this turbo time parameter, where we find that the turbo time parameter, tau, is a mathematical parameter in units of seconds that controls the Intel Turbo Boost Technology 2.0 algorithm. So Medion have set this for 15 seconds, at which point it drops back 65 watts, and in the case of this specific i7-8700, that point is around about 3.6 to 3.7 GHz, which is good because it's better than what Intel guaranteed at 3.2 GHz. The problem is, of course, there's a bunch of reviews out there showing this CPU running at 4.3 GHz all-core turbo, and the reason for that should be obvious to everybody. Right, so to wrap this one up, I read a lot of tech news, tech forums, comments on Reddit, etc. And sometimes I read things that disappoint me. But before I get to that, first of all, what exactly is going on here? Well, basically, Intel, as they always have done, are validating their CPUs based on TDP. So why is this an issue now when it wasn't before? The simple answer to that is the previous Intel CPUs were able to hold their clock speeds at their rated TDPs. In fact, in many cases, their i5s were well under their TDP values, but Intel's CPUs never ever scaled well with extra cores and power. Remember Broadwell E? That thing had monstrous power. And then we saw with Skylake X as well. And they don't scale very well with hyperthreading either with power. So by adding more cores to Coffee Lake, they've essentially given you some very fast and very power hungry CPUs. But they're still trying to segment it somehow. And this is why they only give base and single core turbo values. This is the big change that the tech press didn't do enough about. Some in the tech press did mention it, but many just swept it under the rug, or more likely, they didn't know about it. But essentially, Intel can now sell you any piece of crap whatsoever with their base clock of 2.8 GHz, for example, on that i5-8400. That really can be the worst possible silicon, and they can sell you that justifiably. And if that is how that CPU performs, you will have zero recourse. This was what should have been heavily resisted in the tech press. As it is, a lot of these reviewers are gonna get maybe lucky, because it's safe to say that Intel gave them the best CPUs. They gave them the i7-8700K and the i5-8400, but they could have given them the i7-8700 as well, and then all of them would have shown the same results, because they were all using high-end motherboards and high-end cooling solutions that would have shown the i7-8700 running around 4.3 GHz for a long turbo duration. You stick that in a 65 watt motherboard, it's going to run at 3.6 GHz or thereabouts. The i5-8400, as I said in the Coffee Lake Con Job video, which incidentally I now consider to be one of my best videos, so go back and watch that after you've watched this and see what you think of it now. The thing about the i5-8400 is it doesn't have the hyperthreading, so even though it's the worst quality silicon, and remember it's only rated for 2.8 GHz, so you really could get the worst quality there. But because it doesn't have hyperthreading at 65 watts, it may be just about be able to hold 3.8 GHz on all 6 cores, but I don't think so. That also depends on your cooling, of course. 3.4 seems a little bit more likely to me, but we're really just going to have to wait and see how that one ends up. Essentially what's happening in the tech press here is everybody's got high-end components, high-end cooling, high-end motherboards. This is how these companies, Intel and AMD, this is how they want their products seen. What Intel is doing here is basically no different to AMD's XFR technology. If you remember, AMD made a big noise about XFR. The problem with XFR is Ryzen was locked at around 4.1, 4.2 GHz. But it's the same thing here. Coffee Lake is basically XFR on steroids, and I expect Pinnacle Ridge, or Zen Plus, to do exactly the same thing. Us guys in the tech press will get the best motherboards, we'll get great cooling solutions, and we will get unrepresentative scores compared to what the vast majority of the average users will get with these CPUs. So we need to decide if we are catering to enthusiasts or are we catering to the masses, because these companies have basically found a way to use us in the press, to make their products look better and perhaps give you, the viewer, the reader, the wrong impression. So if you remember back to the beginning of this video, where I showed this chart showing all the results, and I said that the guys at the end, they got it completely wrong with the multi-core enhancement enabled. But I said the guys in the middle looked like they had got the right result, but in actual fact, it's the guys at the left who got the scores that are more representative of the average 8700K. If you remember those first two scores, the 1230 HP Omen score, the X Preview 1262 score, and we now know that the ALDI PC, the Medion Eraser, scores 1203 points. That's at 3.6.5 GHz. Is it really such a massive stretch to assume that the HP Omen, another OEM system, and the X Preview one as well, were only running at maybe 3.8, 3.9 GHz, rather than the supposed 4.3 GHz all-core turbo of the 8700K? And that was basically my entire point in this great Coffee Lake con job video. And for that, I get labelled a conspiracy theorist again, and a bunch of them lined up to have a go at me on Twitter as well. And to be honest, I'm just getting really tired of it, and I can't do it any longer. And by that I mean I can no longer be diplomatic with these guys. After I released this video, I read comments on Twitter saying that I was getting desperate, but there was also a poster on Reddit who apologised to me for linking the Twitter thread and that I had read it. But my response to that was simple. It simply makes my job easier. The fact is, the same as I told Hilbert, I am not out to give these guys a hard time, but after the great Coffee Lake con job video and the fallout after it, they have made my job really easy. So for 2018, I did something that I haven't done in a very long time. I made a New Year's resolution, and I resolved to scrutinise the tech press even closer than I have been up until now, but without holding anything back. The reality is, I did not get popular because I'm a conspiracy theorist. I got popular because there is a perception of cluelessness and bias in the general tech press. And one or two of you are just a little bit too self-serving as well. But you'll be finding out about that in a video coming soon. In the end, if you're doing your job properly, then I won't have to do it for you. But for sure, as 2018 progresses, Intel's desperation will progress as well. And I expect 2018 to be the hardest and dirtiest fought year we have ever seen. I'm just glad to be a part of it. Right, so the very last thing for me to do is pick the lucky winner of the awesome Mini ITX chassis and Vega 64 limited edition, which is the competition launched with my custom Mini ITX build video. So there was a total of 3,163 entries, and the winner was Bilal Kaduri, entry number 2375 from Munich in Germany. So massive congratulations to you, that is a wonderful prize, and I'll send your email to Brian, who will be in touch with you soon. Best of luck next time to all the other entrants. And for the 3,000 plus of you who didn't win, there will always be the next competition. So that's me done for this one now. Don't forget to like and subscribe, check out my Amazon links and stuff in the video description below, and I'll catch you later guys.